Now it is. So I know you're probably thinking, we just had to listen to you twice on Sunday. We're looking forward to Larry Rouse tonight, and I'm sorry, he chickened out. I'm just kidding. He and I went to New York and did a good preacher study this weekend, and I'm going to be gone preaching in Alabama Sunday, so we just switched. So tonight we're continuing our Genesis class, and then next week we're going to finish Genesis and move into Exodus. This is actually, I really love studying this section. We're in Joseph's account, but there was something about it this time that the whole thing, it just kept striking me with new things as I was rereading, preparing for the study, and it was just really amazing. But let's take a second to remember the context. What has just happened to Joseph? Yep. He has been sold into slavery by his brothers. And then we went over and we saw a little bit about Judah in chapter 38, the unfortunate things that happened with Judah and Tamar. But now we're put right back over to Joseph. And it's an amazing story, what happens here. So we've got, so far in Genesis, we've been following one family, the family of Jesus. And each person that the narrative has followed has been the person that God has directly given his promises to, with the exception of one occasional section, like what we did last week with Judah. But Judah will eventually be the person who inherits the promises. So it's almost random, knowing that Joseph does not receive the promises, that we take this long break to go from the line of Jesus over to Joseph, not the one next in line. And if you just look at the story of Joseph alone, it really does seem like a random little event that God puts in place. But what we're going to see is that even though it's not connected to the direct lineage of Jesus, God is using this, showing us some of the work he does in the background in order to preserve that line of Jesus. And so, although when we're reading through it, we don't know, although we can know because we've read all of it before, but we don't exactly understand why is this here. It's because God is showing us how his providence works, how he uses people in the background to further his ultimate plan in the scriptures. That's what Joseph does. But in this case, we're looking at when he uses someone faithful. And so, just been sold into slavery. Do anyone remember who he was sold into? Or who he was sold to? Potiphar. And so, this is a man who is of great importance. What was Potiphar's job? Verse 1.
Captain of the guard.
Yeah, he was the captain of the guard. He was a very rich and powerful man, rich enough to have multiple slaves. And although a lot of times you get the picture that just everybody in old times owned slaves, that's just not true at all. You still had to be wealthy, although sometimes you could own one. Potiphar owned a whole collection. And he brings in Joseph, and Joseph was shown to be not like the other servants. Why? In verse 2. Yeah, God was with him, and it says because God was with him specifically that he made the house of Potiphar prosper for the sake of Joseph. That's in verse 5. And so what does that remind you of? Abraham. We've said over and over how Abraham and his sons were told as they received the promises that those who are with you get blessed by association. And even though Joseph is not going to be the one who Christ's come through the line of Christ, he is still a child of Israel. And so he gets a part or a portion of those blessings. And that means that the people around him, when he is, of course, faithful, will be blessed in association. And so Potiphar had more than before just by getting the slave. And he quickly comes to favor Joseph. Verse 3 tells us that he specifically notices that God is with him, and he saw himself that everything Joseph did was a prosperous endeavor, and that was because of what? Who did he give a credit to? Yeah, Potiphar gave credit to a Hebrew god. Now, as we get through this, it's important to realize the Egyptians didn't like the Hebrews. They thought of them as less. One of the things that Egyptians despised or saw as very lowly were shepherds. How did Jacob make his money? He had flocks. He was a shepherd. His children were shepherds. We saw that in Genesis 37 when they were away to shepherd the flocks. Joseph was also a shepherd. It's just a big thing. Egyptians hate shepherds. Hebrews are full of shepherds. Egyptians hate the Hebrews. And they hate anything associated with the Hebrews, including their God. And so when it says Potiphar gives credit to this blessing to God, and it would be Joseph's God, that's something that should catch our attention. It's something obvious enough that it makes an Egyptian see, at least to some extent, that the Hebrew God is doing something and is not totally useless. And so Joseph became Potiphar's favorite and was even made to be second in command in his household over everything that he had. That's in the latter half of verse 5. And so God continues to bless him. He had so much trust in Joseph, and I love this about what it says about Joseph, is that he had so much trust in him that Potiphar didn't even know what all he had in his house. It says the only thing that he was concerned about was what he ate. That's all he had to care about because he knew Joseph was going to work hard and take care of everything else, and he knew that Joseph wasn't going to be dishonest and take his things. He had total trust, and so Joseph was set in a position where he had a lot of power, even as a slave. This was a position you would typically give to your son as the head of the house. And we don't know if he had kids or not, but still impressive that Joseph made it to this position. But then verse 6 ends with a very interesting statement. What does it say?
That Joseph was handsome and form and appearance.
Thank you. The Bible does not often remark on appearance. But when it does, it always has a purpose. Why do you think we're told that Joseph was just so attractive?
To explain why Potiphar's wife was so,
Right,
for
exactly.
for lack of a better way of saying it, hung up on him.
Yeah. Yeah, she saw this man and she thought that was a hunk of a guy. And so from that point on, I guess since they took him, she was attracted to Joseph and she wanted him. She really did. And what does Joseph, well, first in verse 7, she asks him to sleep with her. But I love verse 8. Would you read that for me, Pete? Verse 8.
But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house.
And then verse 9.
And, and he has committed all that he has to my hand." You want me to read verse 9 too?
Yes, please.
Okay. "There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?"
So first, Joseph was put in a position of power, and now he's put in a position where he can sleep with the head of the house, wife, head of the house's wife, which would be the other person who would be important at the time. And she is coming after him. So there is really every indication that he could totally do this, and he could probably get away with it for a time because of his position in the home. But in verse 8, he refuses. What I love is what he says in verse 9. First, he tells him, your husband has given me power over everything in his house except you. But then, instead of saying, how could I do this against Potiphar? How could I do this against you? It's how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Now, if he had done this thing, it would have been bad against Potiphar and a dishonor on Potiphar's wife, but that wasn't what mattered to Joseph. He cared about dishonoring God, about doing this great wickedness against the God who put him in this position in the first place, who gave him the ability and the opportunity. And so he says this one time, but is that the end of what happens? No. Verse 10, she keeps asking day by day, and he keeps refusing. And something I'd like to point out is this isn't the attitude of a person who is doing this for the first time, the Potiphar's wife. You get the indication that this is repeated. This isn't new. She sees this and she thinks she can get away with it for some reason, even though Potiphar trusts him so much. You're given the indication this is a very promiscuous woman in a lot of different ways. And we're not going to put that as fact because it doesn't say that for sure, but we get that as the attitude. That's what I at least have seen in it. And so one day, as she continues to do this, she gets him totally alone, and that's in verse 11. And what happens? Verse 11.
Well, he refuses again, and he flees, and she grabs his coat
Yeah. So,
or scarf.
yeah, it's a little bit the other way around, but that's right. She grabs his coat, and she's basically you can imagine you how desperate you are if you're holding on to somebody asking for something. Please sleep with me. And he pulls his cloak off and runs out of the room. He literally flees, the text says. And when she realizes what happened, she's still got his cloak in her hand. She's probably thinking, I'm in trouble this time. So she has to quickly on her feet say, somebody help! And so the men who weren't in the house run in and see that she's got Joseph's cloak, and she's going and saying, this Hebrew that Potiphar brought into our house to laugh at us has tried to sleep with me. And it's important to understand how the Egyptians felt about Hebrews, like we mentioned earlier, because you can see how quickly the other men would be like, you're so right. This is terrible. A stinking Hebrew was mocking you in this way. And so they easily are riled up. And she goes and she tells Potiphar her version of the story, and he is very angry. Now, Joseph was a great guy. Clearly, everybody saw that before this event. They trusted him. Potiphar knew him to the point where he didn't look at anything in his house. And when I read this for a long time, I put a lot of blame on Potiphar in this situation. I was like, how can you do that to someone who had just said you made second in command over your own house? But now, as a married man, it kind of shifts your position because I was thinking, what if my wife came up to me? Maybe she made herself look like she was all sad. She had what is clearly evidence against that man, and she's begging, saying, this guy did this to me. Would I believe my wife, the person who's supposed to be closest to me in the world, or would I believe the slave who I liked? Well, I would have to say I'd believe my wife because I love her. I wouldn't want to think she was lying about that situation. When you're in a close relationship, you don't want to think the other person is lying. And so you trust them first. And when you believe what she said, which is essentially that Joseph tried to force himself on her, I think I would be outraged, just like Potiphar was. And so you kind of see, you put yourself in his shoes, you understand how this gets so bad. And so Potiphar takes Joseph and throws him in prison. And I'd like to say, I would think if Potiphar heard this, he would have killed Joseph. But since he had at one point trusted Joseph so much, you can almost see that a part of that was the reason he was thrown in prison instead. Because why else would you keep a Hebrew who was a slave who just tried to force himself on your wife, especially if you were the Egyptian guard, captain, not guard, but captain, and you didn't have to answer if you did want to get rid of him. I think that there is evidence to show that this was a small mercy.
And it could be, again, this is just my possibility. is that he might have known who his wife was, and maybe rather than having him executed, he did this. You never know. That he's a pretty sharp guy to be where he's at.
Yeah.
And if this is not her first time around, who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows?
And I've thought about that too. And I weighed the differences, but I also just comes back, his anger was greatly aroused.
Yes.
And so either way, he's thrown in prison and he's not killed, which we can say is a blessing from God and probably providential because of God putting Joseph in such of a great position before all of this happened. But despite all of that, he's thrown in prison. And we don't exactly know how long he was in Potiphar's household, but at least long enough to become a trusted man. So there's been some time in Egypt. Now that he is thrown in prison, what's the situation? Verse 21.
The Lord showed him mercy and gave him favor.
Yeah. So again, Joseph thrown into another situation that he did not deserve, second time in a row now, and yet he stays faithful to God. How do we know that he stays faithful to God? God is continuing to bless him. God is continuing to give him favor, and everything he does is prosperous. So, despite his brothers betraying him, despite Potiphar's wife betraying him, he still looks favorably on by the Lord because he trusts Yahweh. And notice in both situations he's been put into, he puts all of his effort into the work that he's doing. In Potiphar's household, he works hard enough to become the second in command. Here it happens again, as a prisoner in the king's prison, according to the text. He works hard enough and is trustworthy enough that he's put in second in command again, except over the jailer and the ability to let himself free. You see some similarities between the two events. Thrown into something he doesn't deserve, trust in God, God blesses him, he's put in second place. It's going to happen again in just a little bit. But anyways, we continue, and I want to ask just a couple questions. Did Joseph have reasons to be discouraged and possibly blame God? Absolutely. I can't imagine if my two brothers came up and, and tied me up, threw me in a pit, and sold me as a slave. And we're in a totally different time period. This is terrible. Joseph did not deserve it. He was obeying his father. What about at Potiphar's house? Could he have blamed God for this situation? Well, many people would have. Because did he do anything bad again? No. But does he blame God? No. He trusts in God. And even more than that, he trusts in God, and because of his trust, continues to obey and puts everything into whatever he's doing in whatever situation it is. And I couldn't help but think as I read through this again of Colossians chapter 3 and verse 17, which says, and whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord, giving thanks to God the Father through him, which is Jesus. And you have to just imagine everything Joseph is doing is for the Lord, or else the situations he was in, he couldn't have gotten to the position that God put him in otherwise. And also, people noticed when God was with Joseph. And so every time he trusted in him, no matter the low of the situation, God helped him. And so even as a slave, even as a prisoner, Joseph was okay. He was taken care of. Let's see. Are there any questions on chapter 39?
It's interesting. I like Colossians 3:17, where it talks about giving thanks to God.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting, verse 21 of Genesis 39, it says God showed his steadfast love toward him. Well, how was he able to see that steadfast love? That had to be his providential care, and it consistently saw that and recognized that. So I think that's very, very important that he constantly saw God, even in these difficult circumstances.
Yeah, I agree. And he wouldn't have been able to get out otherwise. Okay, anything else on 39?
I think this is something that we should consider when feel like we're being suffering. Maybe this is for the better for us. You have to think along that line.
Yeah, exactly. We don't really know But we do know that we can trust God, even though we don't know our situation.
And one other thing, those dreams that he had, they kind of fulfilled. There's a future here. He was
Right. We're going to see that really soon.
Yeah, and so, but he recognized that he had hope, he had thankfulness, hope. So yeah, I think that's interesting.
Exactly. And you had your hand up?
I think it's pretty interesting how it's a repetition throughout the Bible. You always see that God places a right hand man of his in authority and to speak to the ear of the person who's in authority. And it makes me think of the times that we're in now, you know. God will always have his hand in everything that happens.
Right. We talked about that a lot this week about how we can just, we don't know what's happening in the world right now, but we can know God's going to take care of it. And he's got his people where he needs them. Okay. If there's nothing else on 39, we'll briefly cover chapter 40. Although I guess I missed a couple things. I've got a few pictures I like for these upcoming visions. Not these yet, but we'll get them. So some time passes, we don't know how much, but clearly enough time for Joseph to become in charge of a prison as a prisoner. So clearly some things had to happen. He had to prove himself. But Pharaoh put two men in prison. Does anyone remember what the two men were? Yeah, a butler and a baker. And I put cupbearer there because he is a butler, but the job that it described is the job of a cupbearer to the king. But butler is what it's translated to. What's that?
That's how it's translated.
Right, a lot of times. Yeah. And so he puts these two men in prison. And verse 2 and verse 4 tells us that Joseph was put in charge of them. So this is a prisoner who has been put in charge of other prisoners because of the trust that man has in him. And so his responsibilities would of course include feeding them, making sure they were still alive, bringing them whatever the case was. And this kind of gives you a good idea of the kind of authority that Joseph had, so that the guards trusted him not to have to look behind what he was doing, which is something chapter 39 said. They didn't even have to check behind what Joseph was doing, and he was working as a prison. But they didn't check because they knew he did it right. And I just love the idea of somebody working well enough and with enough integrity that their captors don't even have to check their work because they know they did it right because they asked them to do it. That's an interesting insight to Joseph and even more. But then we get to these two men, and they both have dreams on the same night. And this is within, obviously, they've been here long enough. It says in the text, they were here for some time. And so they've been here long enough that Joseph gets to know them. And we see that because in verse 7, he's like, "Why are you sadder than usual today?" Which is kind of funny. You're sad if you're in prison. But Joseph knew them enough to be like, you're slightly more sad than usual. And they tell him, what do they tell him? Yeah, they both had a dream, but they don't know, or they don't have anyone to interpret it. And so Joseph, he goes and he tells them, "Well, I can't interpret your dream, but my God can." Not verbatim, but that's what he says. And so he says, "Tell me your dream." And they tell him, and the first, the cupbearer or the butler, dreams of three branches coming from a vine. And so here's a picture where you've got the vine, that's the thicker cord, and you can literally see the three little branches that it would be talking about. And each one of the branches that he mentions has a cluster of grapes, just like this, a very fruitful branch, which is also not super common for one branch to have that many clusters just right beside each other. Not the main point. Still, this is the vision he sees. One branch, three clusters of grapes on three, or one vine, three clusters of grapes on three branches. And he says that he takes these cups, or these grapes, mashes them into Pharaoh's cup, and directly hands it into the hand of Pharaoh, which is what he used to do. And so God reveals to Joseph that the meaning of that dream is that the cupbearer will be returned to his position of work in 3 days. Pharaoh says 3 days, three clusters of, Joseph says 3 days, three clusters of grapes. That's what that represents. And that's very specific, is what I'd like to point out. in 3 days. They've been here for a long time. And Joseph all of a sudden says, in 3 days, you're going to go back to the work of Pharaoh. That's something obviously provable. You see so many prophecies today where it's like, in 90 years, this will happen. And, even still, 90 years later, if anyone's still alive, it doesn't happen. But that's hard to prove to the current generation. This is something easy to prove. In 3 days, you're going back. Okay, very important to remember. But what does he ask the man to do in verse 14?
To remember him.
Yeah, remember me. I'm not here for anything I've done. This is an unfair punishment. Remember me before Pharaoh. He's so confident in his interpretation of his dream that he's asking him to talk to Pharaoh when he gets back. Keep in mind, these are two prisoners. Okay, then we have the second dream, and I kind of feel bad. I mean, I do feel bad for the guy because the baker hears this interpretation, and it says that he saw that it was a favorable interpretation, and so you can almost imagine him like kind of getting a little excited in prison, like, oh, well, tell me about mine. Well, this time there is the picture of the baker with 3 baskets full of fresh bread, but the birds are coming down and eating the bread out of the top basket. And there's nothing about, well, he has 3 baskets. So again, Joseph says, that's 3 days. And in 3 days, you'll get to go to the court of Pharaoh, but your head will be cut off. And so you can almost imagine he's like, oh, 3 days, the court of Pharaoh. And then he says nothing else in the text, so you can just see him just kind of sitting in the corner. And so it's an interesting situation that's been set up, very provable timeline.
And you notice, uh, Joseph didn't ask him to remember.
Yeah, that's true. He didn't say.
Context is the-
That's so true. That is so true. He did not say to remember anything because he won't be thinking much longer. And so, unfortunately for the baker, he's done for in 3 days. But that's another thing. And it would be interesting if one of the prophecies came through in 3 days. But he gives 2 different interpretations, 2 different results, same timeline. It would be very interesting if both of those things came to pass within that very provable timeline. And so when the third day comes, it tells us in the text it was Pharaoh's birthday, verse 20. And exactly what Joseph said through, of course, what God said happened or was going to happen, happened in the exact way that Joseph said. So the baker dies and the cupbearer gets to return to his job. But what happens? He forgot him. Imagine forgetting the one man who gave you hope in prison. The one man who was kind to you, who sat there and interpreted with you. It's all gone. But I can also, on the other hand, you're just so excited to finally be back. You're thinking that you're gonna die. You've been in prison. You don't know how long you are, but you're returning back to normal life. And there's a part of the human psyche that wants to erase a time period that was filled with bad things when your life returns back to normal. And so you can't exactly put a ton of blame on the cupbearer, but still he did I mean, you can at least understand, but he still did wrong by not following his word to Joseph.
So to speak, he may be sticking his neck out if he says anything to Pharaoh.
Right.
Just got put to death. He would have to have some commitment.
And I actually will point that out when he does talk to Pharaoh, because even mentioning a Hebrew slave in jail would be sticking your neck out, especially coming right back from prison. You're a little worried. But you can kind of understand, at least. I try to be not as cynical towards people in my reading. Nowadays, anyways, I used to be like, oh, this is an idiot. How could you forget that? But you got to be understanding of people, they have emotions. They're scared, they forget. It happens. It's just unfortunate, but you could almost say, and I really think you could say that it was providential because now Joseph is set up for this amazing prison exit in chapter 41. So are there any questions on chapter 40? All right. Then in verses 1 through 8, Pharaoh has a dream, and he sees 7 healthy fat cows I tried to find a good picture of a healthy cow, but I guess there's some trend or something, and this is the only picture of a fat cow that I could find that was any good. So this is what we're gonna see. 7 fat cows, okay? And I think it's still a good illustration because that's a lot fatter than usual. Like that's a cow with a lot of beef. What'd you say? Yeah, very healthy. So, so you can imagine the 7 of these fatties walking around, and Pharaoh's like, "Woo! Well, that's some good steak." Or at least that's what I'd be thinking. But then all of the sudden, on the other hand, he sees 7 skinny, ugly cows. And I picked this particular picture because it was really disgusting to me. But he specifically says when he's explaining his dream later that what he's seeing is cows uglier than have ever been in Egypt. This, so you see, yeah, yeah. And there's 7 of these. You see the 7 steaks and you're salivating. And then you see these guys and you're disgusted. But the point is that these guys eat the big fatties, but then they still look like that. Would that not be weird? I know that when I eat dinner, sometimes I have to unbutton my belt or loosen an extra notch. We've all experienced that, being a little bloated from a big meal. But these guys, you can almost get the imagine. It's shocking that they still look so skinny, like they have had nothing ever. The ugliest cows that he's ever seen is what he's gonna say. And he wakes up after seeing this. They're all dead. And I don't like to imagine cows eating cows. I don't even know how that would be possible. But that's what he saw. And he's disturbed. He wakes up. You can almost imagine he's waking up in a sweat. Then he falls back to sleep. This time in his dream, he has a second dream and he sees 7 ears of healthy grain, which the ear of grain, if you don't already know, is just where the stalk ends and it's the actual part with the grain. That's an ear of grain. And so he sees 7 of those, very healthy, very luscious, ready for the picking. And then he has the 7 bad ones. This is a picture of one that is diseased with all the black markings all over it. And he sees the 7 diseased, rough looking ears of grain consume, whatever that may have looked like, these beautiful, healthy looking pieces of grain. And he wakes up in verse 7 and he's very distraught. He's thinking about it. He doesn't know what it's talking about. And so immediately in verse 8, he's calling everybody who he thinks can help. And the people that are on his mind are the magicians, those who would read the stars. It was very big in Egyptian culture to have people to understand dreams because they meant a lot to the Egyptians. And so when nobody had an explanation, Pharaoh is, you can imagine, very scary mood. He's really wanting, but everybody's failed him. It puts us in the image of what happens with Daniel when the king has no one to interpret. But now, in verse 9, the cupbearer remembers something. What does he remember? What's that?
Joseph.
Yeah, his faults, which would be Joseph. He even says that it's like he remembers it to his shame because he's sad that he forgot him for this long. And so he brings it up in verse 9, and then he tells Pharaoh what Joseph did and how it happened exactly as Joseph said it would happen in verse 13. And so Pharaoh calls Joseph immediately, and what I like is Joseph has been a prisoner for so long, but when he's called by Pharaoh, he still wants to be respectful, and so he shaves, he puts on nice clothing, or the nicest clothing a prisoner would have, and rushes over to Pharaoh as presentable as he can be. And so when he gets there, Pharaoh asks him to interpret the dream, but Joseph says, "No, I won't be interpreting the dream." He really, very strictly, God will be interpreting the dream. Verse 16. Now imagine the bravery you would have to be a Hebrew slave in prison, called before Pharaoh. Pharaoh tells you to do something and you correct him. No, it's not me, it's God. But thankfully, Pharaoh was in a mindset where he didn't just wipe Joseph off the face of the earth, but instead response. Yes?
And this was a dream from God. This is something that Pharaoh never experienced.
Right,
He recognized that.
right.
He was wanting to know.
And that's one of the points that I want to make about these dreams that the cupbearer, the baker, Pharaoh had, is it's not a vague dream. It's not a lucid dream that we can experience and remember some of the things some of the time. Maybe remember dreams decently well. This is a vivid, scary dream that you feel like is real. A lot of the times when we're reading about dreams, they don't realize it's fake until they wake up that day and they're like, "Oh, this is that wasn't real life." That's what happened to Pharaoh. They're very distinct from normal dreams that people have. And so that's why Pharaoh's not going to take some baloney answer from the interpreters that doesn't make any sense. Since it's from God, he'll know when the answer comes from God. Did you have your hand up, Julie?
No, I was, what I was gonna say was not in the right timeline.
Okay. Okay.
It
Well,
didn't want-
well, Pharaoh then in verses 17 through 24 recounts the dream back to Joseph, and he says that no one's been able to explain it to him. But Joseph begins to explain to him, but every time Joseph starts to explain, he says what he says in verse 25, God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. God has revealed this to me. God has shown it to you. And so Joseph goes through and he tells him the 7 fatty cows represent 7 good years for Egypt. I love that picture. I'm sorry. They represent 7 great years of plenty for Egypt. The 7 skinny cows represent 7 years of famine, a famine that is going to be so great that you totally forget about this guy. And so then he says it's the same meaning here, specifically verse 28. It says, God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. 2 dreams, this is repeated 2 times. You think Pharaoh is going to get the message? You better hope so. Or we can't imagine what God would be showing him the rest of the night. And so then in verse 31, that's what I was mentioning about the famine being so bad that the years of good will be forgotten. And so he ends in verse 32 by saying, again, God has shown Pharaoh this. And it was going to be done by the Hebrew God, not by any Egyptian god. It was Yahweh. So then verses 33 through 36, Joseph tells Pharaoh the instructions that God has given along with the interpretation, and they need to find someone to enact all of those instructions. But Pharaoh says, you, you do it. And so the rest of the chapter is all about Joseph being made into this powerful person in Egypt. And it's emphasized for the 3rd time in Joseph's life. He has now been put second in command over everything that he's presiding over, but this time it's over all of Egypt. He has so much power in verse 44 that it says no one can even lift a hand without the permission of Joseph. And so, over and over again, God has used Joseph's faithfulness to put him in a position where he can help those who are around him. And now he's going to be the one who helps all the nations who will be suffering in this famine. And so Joseph is given a wife. He has 2 children, Ephraim and Manasseh. He goes through all of the 7 years of plenty, and it says that they have stored up so much grain. I think it was verse 49, yeah. So much grain that they lost count after they counted as many as the grains of sand. Pretty crazy. You can imagine it's going to have to be a massive stockpile, especially because after the years of plenty, in the end of this chapter, the years of famine begin. And it's so bad, and it's not just on Egypt, it's on all the nations around them. And it's so bad that the Egyptians are having to sell things to get grain because they have nothing. And when they turn to Pharaoh and say, please give us grain, Pharaoh, I love it. He says, turn to Joseph. He's the one. He's got the plan. He knows what he has to do. And so the chapter ends with the famine beginning, and all of the nations are turning to Joseph to uh, to get grain from Egypt. And it's all providential. Why is this great famine happening? Well, that's what we're going to see in these next few chapters. We'll briefly try to cover chapter 42. We'll try to end at 7:50, which is only 5 extra minutes if you can take it. If not, you can just walk out. I can't stop it. But we get to Genesis chapter 42, and these first 24 verses were taken away from everything that Joseph is doing for a brief moment and going back to Israel and his sons. And so now he tells in verse 1 to go to Egypt to buy grain. Why is he telling him to go to Egypt? Because everybody knows that's the place you have to go. It's just like Joseph's work. Everybody knew that was the man associated with God, the one who prospered by God. Everyone now knows Egypt is where the grain is. And so he tells them to go in verse 3, and then 10 of them go, and who stays? Verse 4. Benjamin. And we could talk about why you think that is, but really the answer is he's already lost Joseph. He's lost Rachel, who gave him both Joseph and Benjamin. Benjamin is the last thing he has of that part of his life, but really the favorite part of his life. He thinks Joseph is dead. He's not going to let Benjamin go for no reason. And the brothers then, 10 of them, travel all the way to Egypt, and they go to the place where Joseph happens to be overlooking the current location, which is definitely providential because Joseph had storehouses all over Egypt and he was selling from places all over Egypt, and they happened to meet in the one where Joseph is. But that's besides the point. We're getting into it. And in verse 6, that's where they see Joseph. In verse 7, he sees them, but he acts like he doesn't know them. And he speaks some translations say he speaks roughly, some translations say he speaks harshly, but both of those words get the point across. He was not being kind in his words. And so verse 8 tells us he clearly recognized them. They did not recognize him. Why do you think that was?
This is a man of power. They sold him into slavery.
That is absolutely one of the biggest things. Last time they sold him was this child, this weak younger brother, who had no way he could stop them from doing what they were about to do. This time they're going and seeing him, and he is, one, dressed like an Egyptian. He would have the Egyptian jewelry and the clothing that Pharaoh gave him. He shaved his face, which was an Egyptian trait, not a Hebrew trait. He would have had the makeup. He looked like an Egyptian. He looked like a powerful man. And it's kind of like, people always joke, how do you not recognize Superman when he has the glasses on versus when he has the glasses off? But the thing is, when he's Clark Kent, he's over here, he's got a slouch. He kind of talks all squirrely. He's a big mess. He's a klutz. He's got his glasses. He's got a suit on. He makes himself unrecognizable. And you're also expecting to see him in that form. But when he's Superman, he's tall, he's powerful, he's got a big voice, he's flying, he's excellent. You don't expect that to be the Clark Kent you know. The same person, no magic, unrecognizable. Totally different situation. That's the kind of thing they come to when they see their brother in Egypt. But then he accuses them of being spies when they tell him where they're from. And they try to tell him, no, it's not true. We're from this one family. We have another brother. One of them is dead. And they're panicking. But he takes them all to prison in verse 19. And after 3 days, it wasn't that he just put them in prison for an hour and went to talk to them. He put his brother in prison for 3 days and then went and talked to them. And then he left again to go think about these things and comes back and he says, I'm going to keep Simeon. The rest of you are going to go home and bring your brother. He's saying it like that to make them scared, to bring your brother to prove that you are not spies. And so reluctantly they agree, but I like what Reuben says in verse 21. They're saying that this is a punishment for what they did to Joseph. They don't know this is Joseph, but clearly all of this time they've at least been feeling some sort of regret, especially Reuben, who we said did not sell Joseph into slavery, but was rather gone when it happened. They've been thinking about this all this time. And so they run home, just the 9 of them. But before they leave, they're talking amongst themselves, saying these things about Joseph in their language because they didn't understand Joseph knew what they were saying. The text even tells us that they didn't know he knew what they're saying because he used an interpreter, which you can imagine was just a part of his disguise. I don't understand this Hebrew language. What are you doing? So he's talking through an interpreter. And that is a political move that many people make that is a power move, where you make people believe you don't understand what they're saying so that you can hear what they're saying behind the scenes without having to do any spying. You're right there. Joseph's doing that exact thing. He hears everything his brother's saying. He even weeps one of the times, has to leave the room, recollects himself, sends the 9 away with the grain, but he does something to make even more sure that they come back. He puts the money that they paid with back in the grain. Why would they do that? Well, they get home, they pour out the grain, they see all their money, they're frozen in fear. This looks like now, not only are we trying to say we're not spies, but we have to defend ourselves about being thieves. And it gives Joseph another reason to arrest them when they come back. So it's just a big mess, is what it looks like. And you're almost thinking when you come to this chapter, why is Joseph doing this? This is a faithful man of God. He's done so much good. What is happening? And although I don't personally agree with what he's doing, or the methods at least, he is testing to see if his brothers were the same people who put him in the pit, to see if he can take care of them, if he can trust them now, if they've changed at all. What's the number one way to do that? How do you treat your new youngest brother? Let me see. What do you do for him? What do you do in these situations? He's seeing if they've grown at all. Because we know Joseph's grown. We know where he is in his position. He needs to know. And although the methods are a little sketchy, that's what he's doing. Are there any thoughts or questions on these chapters? Okay. Well, next Wednesday, because we've swapped until I get back, next Wednesday we'll be doing Genesis again. And we're going to try and just go ahead and finish the book. Because there's a lot of wrapping up that these last few chapters do. But I would encourage you over the week to read chapter 43 through the end of the book, just to help you in our study here. And if you have any thoughts or questions you want to share, feel free to tell me anytime. All right, I think that's it. I hope you enjoyed the high quality PowerPoint.